Okay, so here's the last of the core ideologies, socialism. See what I've done there with the colour? Okay, so this video is going to deal with what it is. Okay, I'm going to get rid of that word and I'm going to replace it with its root word, which is social. Okay, so socialism is concerned with the group and rather than the individual. Okay, so the key to socialism is equality. If we thought about the key to liberalism, will probably be freedom. The key to conservatism might be security or the state or tradition or something like that. The key to socialism is going to be equality and fairness between people. But before we look at that, the real tensions for socialists are how much equality do you want? And crucially, how are you going to achieve it? So we're going to look at the first principle, which is collectivism. So collectivism you can think of as people getting together and doing things together for a common good. Okay. Now socialists think that is a good idea. Firstly, because they think it is the right thing to do. So socialists believe that is the moral and correct way to run a society is to think of others before you think of yourself. But also they argue that it's actually more efficient. So they think actually that capitalism, despite what we're told, is very wasteful. And that actually if you kind of centrally plan things or you cooperate together as opposed to all competing, then it makes for a more efficient thing. So as opposed to loads of people producing the same thing, there's just a few people working together to produce more of one or two things. I guess if I were to boil it down, it would be something like that. Okay, so how does collectivism work in the real world? Well, we can look at it from any of these points of view. Okay, so let's start at the top and work around this kind of circle. So collectivism is housing. So we can see that with council housing and social housing. So lots of it that popped up in the UK, for instance, after the war. People thought that people deserved, after fighting, a decent place to live, with inside toilets and running water and central heating and all the rest of it. And so they collectivized some, not all, housing. Okay, they think industrial relations should be collective. So what does that mean? So that means they think that unions should, people should get together. Say I work in car manufacturing, I should get together with my fellow workers. We form a union, and we all bargain together. Okay, and so if the employer tries to do something like cut our hours or cut our pay, then we all speak with one voice, and that's better for workers. Education could be like that. So comprehensive free education is a socialist principle. Don't have it in all countries. Industry collectivism, what does that mean? Well, we're really talking about nationalisation. So that is when the government, or well, basically the government owns national industry, and it is run not for the profit of private people, but for the overall good of the society and good of the economy. And any profits it does make get reinvested or get given back to the taxpayer. Healthcare. We have a very socialist healthcare system, probably one of the most socialist in the world, actually, where healthcare is free and we all pay our taxes, and that pays the worst wages of doctors and nurses, and the drug bills, and the price of running hospitals, etc., etc. That is collectivism in action. Okay, so so you can see how this principle of the group activity can span into lots of different spheres for socialists. Okay. Okay, so next we come to the idea of our common humanity, which is very much connected to socialist idea about human nature and what it is to be a human. So they basically argue that we cooperate more than we have a tendency to cooperation. Note the word tendency. Okay, we don't always cooperate under always certain circumstances, but we actually lots of our actions cooperate, and they think that's a good thing. Obviously, they support collectivism. But they also argue that our human nature is generally positive and is malleable according to our circumstances. So they think if we work together in collectivist enterprises, it will foster our feeling of connection towards each other. Okay, so human nature can be affected by the circumstances of society. Okay, so if we build a society which is generally cooperative, where we share a common humanity, then the outcomes will be positive, and they kind of contrast that with capitalism, okay, which they think is very individualistic, and they don't like that. Okay, so they think that in a capitalist world, that will encourage the more negative sides of our human nature to come out. Our competitive sides, our greedy sides, our belligerent sides, our sides of us which will want to, stamp over the next person and get what we want for us. Okay, and they think that will basically, if we choose the former rather than the latter, i.e., cooperation and a common humanity, we will develop. That's morally good for society as well. So in terms of that, we will work towards moral ends as well as economic ends. So they don't deny that people need rewards for their work, but they argue that the rewards are not just material, and that actually people gain pleasure and status and satisfaction from helping others as well. And if you think about it, that's probably true if you, well, to an extent. Okay, so if you talk to a conservative, they will think, no, it's all about competition, and that's what motivates people. But actually, if you talk to many real people, you'll find out that their wage packet is only a small bit of what they like about their job. So there you go. That's kind of their ideas about our common humanity. Okay, so equality is a big deal for socialists. Okay, but why do they believe in it? Well, they have more justified reasons than just saying, well, you should. So let's start off with the first principle, that equality ensures fairness. So for socialists, they argue that the structural inequalities, and when I mean structural inequalities, I mean people being born into certain situations with certain wealth that may have lasted for generations, means that society isn't really meritocratic. So people aren't basically getting to where they could do or should do based on merit. They're doing it based on position. And for socialists, that's not something that's not fair, and something that they want to address. Second thing is that social equality reinforces collectivism. So they argue that, in line with this concept of a common humanity, that people who are fairer, i.e., you are in the same situation as, are more likely to think like you, empathize with you, and be closer to you socially. Okay, so take the example of Sweden, which is quite a cohesive country. It has very high levels of taxation and redistribution, and it generally ranks quite high on the sort of happiness index as well. So people are more likely to kind of cooperate if they are on a more or less more even playing field. And if you contrast that with society that's got fairly vast inequality, take a society like America or Brazil, you can see that they've got very high crime rates, quite high rates of social division, and don't share that kind of common humanity. So that's the second thing. It reinforces collectivism, and it reinforces collective humanity. Last reason is that social equality is a need at a very base level for socialists. It's a means of satisfying basic human needs. So socialists say we all have a right to housing, we all have a right to education, we all have a right to healthcare, and making people more equal is making it much more likely that those basic needs are met. However, they do not agree on exactly how much equality we should have, and as we're going to go see in the second video, there's a lot of difference on that. But just briefly, I'm going to tell you the sort of types of inequality, types of equality that you can have. So starting at the top right, absolute equality. Absolute equality is what people imagine when they imagine of a kind of imagined communism. So everyone's got the same stuff, everyone gets the same wage, or pretty much, everyone lives in the same house. That is absolute equality. If we move anti-clockwise, we've got equality of outcome. And equality of outcome is the basic is kind of the next stage down, I suppose. So that's equality that's focused on people's outcomes in life. Okay, so if absolute equality could be equality of outcome, but focusing on equality of outcome could also mean that you tax the rich quite heavily, so that people in the end have a more equal basis, not necessarily totally equal, but a more equal basis. Moving down, this is the sort of next step down the equality ladder. This is equality of opportunity. So these people who aim for this say that actually to achieve social justice or fairness, all you need to do is give people an equal start in life. So you don't need necessarily mean if they're successful, fine, they're okay with that. They've done that. At least we'll know that they've done that through their own hard work and talents. But they haven't. But it's fine. We're not going to tax them or take it all away from them just because they've been successful. And the last one is the sort of least maybe on the equality scale. So this is equality of welfare. So this is basically an approach to equality which just ensures that the minimum standard of living is achievable by everyone. So everyone's equal when it comes to the fact that we all have clean water, that we all have access to healthcare, that we all have access to education, that we all have a home to live in. Now, even if you take this most basic yardstick, I'd say probably that's the one we've achieved in the UK. I don't believe that we've got true equality of opportunity, let alone any of those other measures. Okay, but it's something. Okay, it's something. But anyway, that's the definitions of equality, and different socialists aim for these different outcomes. Okay, next principle of importance to socialists is social class. Traditionally, socialists have been very concerned about social class, and mostly they like to talk about. Well, let's talk about Marxism first. Okay, so Marxism is particularly concerned about the working class and he calls them the upper class, middle class, bourgeoisie, and the proletariat. So why are they so concerned? So well, I suppose the socialism started as generally an ideology that supported and was in the interest of the working class. Now, how did they justify that? Well, basically that the working class are the ones where injustice and inequality, they were the ones who were suffering it. Okay, so the original Labour movement, I mean, we call it the Labour Party, is in the interest of working people and the working class. However, class actually differs depending on how your approach. So Marx thought that this class was everything. The social class was everything, and he said that basically you could be defined in your class according to whether you owned or controlled the means of production, and that would be the upper class, and who probably should, that picture should be on the top of the pyramid, and the lower class who had to sell your labour. Now, Marx argued that basically as capitalist businesses bought up other capitalist businesses, and they drove up their desire for profits, and that the working class would get paid less and less and less, and that eventually the two classes would be in such conflict that revolution would be inevitable. So he argued that this pyramid would kind of get worse and worse and worse. Now later on, social democrats sort of argued that actually the classes could coexist, and they emphasised a kind of class consensus. So this idea that the classes could talk to each other, work out their differences, and the bosses would pay. If they made more profits, they would pass some of that down to the workers, etc., etc. Now, modern day socialists. In fact, Tony Blair was famously said he wanted to see a classless society. Now, modern day socialists argue that actually this old pyramid of kind of like a growing, ever-growing working class and a kind of smaller and smaller upper class turned out to be a bit false. And if you look at a sort of picture of class in Britain today, it might be more like a diamond. So they're arguing that the upper class, yes, it is getting richer, that's true, but actually the middle class has grown, and the kind of factory urban proletariat class has actually shrunk over recent decades. And so this traditional idea of a working class, what Marx thought was a working class, is kind of gone. So how much class plays how important it is depends on what socialist you are, and also what kind of time you're living in. But class generally is important, and labour is socialism is a movement and a political ideology that belongs, in a sense, to the interests of the working class. Okay, I don't know why it's doing that. Okay, last thing that we're going to look at, I think it's the last thing, is workers' control. Okay, so what some of the remedies that to some of the inequalities and the injustices of capitalist society, according to socialists, is to give workers control. Okay, so give workers more control over businesses, give workers more control over power, those kind of things. I'll give you a few examples. So there you go, give him the control, give him the crown, sort of go full circle. So examples could be the workers' committees that were started after the Russian Revolution, and they would sort of make decisions and feedback to the central power, etc. Actually they became very, very powerful, and I think Lenin actually took measures to sort of to curb their power because he was worried about that, but they were very powerful for a while. Syndicalism in France, and then later in Spain, although the later was a bit more anarchist, but don't worry about that for the moment. This is like really, really strong trade unions. So imagine a factory, and instead of a boss, that all the workers take over, and they make decisions like how much of a product you're going to make, where you're going to sell it, who you're going to sell it to, these kind of things. Okay, and then any profits that they made, instead of going to shareholders and to individual owners, they would be shared out amongst the workforce. Okay, and you can find companies which have workers control. Famously in the UK, John Lewis is a kind of workers control cooperative, not quite, but kind of. And the reasons that they like to do this are workers control combats alienation. So that socialists, or particularly Marx, always argue that alienation is a product of modern work. Is that if you force someone to work and you do it in a very boring up, factory style job, but also you rob them of control over their product, that's a problem. So if you give workers back control, the work becomes more joyful, more enjoyable, and more cooperative. So that's one of the reasons. And secondly, production obviously becomes collective, and therefore not just in the interest of capitalists, but the interest of workers, common people, etc. Oh yes, and so most socialists believe, well, most revolutionary socialists believe that workers' control is an important step towards a socialist society. It's important to probably note here that actually workers' control is probably at the more radical end of socialism. So it probably belongs more to revolutionary socialism, with maybe a bit of social democracy in there, rather than any of the other sort of lighter brands. Okay, so in summary, it's an ideology that mostly arose in respect to the rise of the market economy. So really, socialism starts when capitalism really gets going. It's important to remember that. Okay, so we've looked at all these different revolutions. The Industrial Revolution is really what kickstarts socialism, because it starts to kickstart a lot of inequality. Didn't really mention that. Okay, so we have collectivism, this idea that socialism wants people to work together towards common ends. We have this idea of common humanity, so this feeds into and from collectivism, this idea that we work together and it makes us happier, and makes the economy more fruitful, and all these kind of things. And this feeds into our idea of what we are like as humans, that we are cooperative. It emphasizes equality. It depends on how much equality you want. But all socialists emphasize equality. Social class is important, and workers' control is also important, but more important to certain kinds of socialism, more extreme versions of socialism than others. Okay, that's it.